The study I'm going to present today is actually the first study that I ever scanned at CISC. And it's been rather a long time in the making. It was initially conceived in collaboration as well with Chris Bird, but then as just after I began data collection, Paloma Manguele joined my lab, and she really sort of then took over the study as the first author, and all the analyses I'm going to present today are hers. She's here today, but she has only just submitted her PhD, so we both agreed that it would be a bit much for her to be the one to actually create the presentation, but she's here if you want to ask any questions. Oh, sorry, Paloma, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. You can ask me questions, but Paloma can chip in if she sees fit. But to make sure she gets the credit, and also to Chris Racy, who's also been involved as a collaborator. And to just thank CISC and the School of Psychology for co-funding this study. So I'm going to talk about our findings, but then at the end I'm going to present some potential ideas for grant applications and future research directions. So I'd be really pleased to get your feedback on that. So the experience of trying to focus on something that we're paying attention to, but then finding ourselves instead becoming distracted by something completely irrelevant is probably familiar to most of us, but it's actually quite a serious cognitive failure. In a way, you can see it as some irrelevant thing hijacking your brain so that all of your information processing is redirected to process the wrong thing, and therefore is not processing very well whatever you're trying to pay attention to. And there's tons of research on all sorts of very negative consequences of being distracted. So these can be, it can be a life or death matter. I mean, there's in terms of causing accidents, but also it can just really hinder well-being and productivity. So people who experience more attention problems are more likely to have poorer evaluations at work and reduced productivity. And there's also profound effects on academic achievement. So to give an idea, large-scale longitudinal studies that have followed children from the point that they start school age 5 to the point that they leave find that attention problems are one of the strongest predictors of academic achievement, even if you control for their reading and maths ability when they start school. So it seems like it's something that can have a big effect. And distraction can be both from things around us, but it can also often be from your thoughts. And the thing about being distracted by your thoughts is, unlike external distraction, you can't just avoid this by going into a quiet room. It will follow you. And sometimes the kind of thoughts that can distract us and that can follow us can be quite upsetting, or things that really trouble us. So, for example, we might be thinking about things that we find emotional and particularly distressing. There's been around 70 years of extensive research into attention and distraction, but the focus of this has been near exclusively on attention to perception. So, and conversely, distraction by things in the external environment. And this bias doesn't really reflect the prevalence of external versus internal distraction, because diary studies suggest that actually sources of distraction are equally likely or more likely to be your own thoughts as opposed to things in the environment. Yet overwhelmingly, research is focused on external distraction. And I think this is probably not really for any theoretical reason, but more for a practical reason, which is it's just much harder to study distraction by thoughts. So external distractions are really easy to manipulate and measure. So, for example, if you want to study visual distraction, it's very easy to experimentally introduce a visual stimulus. You know exactly what it is, you know exactly when it appeared, and then you can quite precisely measure the response to it. It's much more difficult to do this with respect to an inherently subjective and uncontrollable and unpredictable phenomenon like spontaneous irrelevant thoughts. So the goal of the present study is to try to overcome this problem to some extent by establishing a new method using neuroimaging to objectively control and then measure and study spontaneous involuntary thoughts, and then using this measure to test for common determinants of internal and external forms of distraction. So given that there's this wealth of knowledge about external distraction, a big interest of mine has been for some time seeing to what extent this also applies to internal distraction from our thoughts. So some of my previous research has looked at this in various different ways behaviourally, but for example, one study looked at individual differences, and we found that a reaction time measure of distraction from visual images, like colourful cartoon characters, so just how slowed down people were when they saw the cartoon, positively correlates with self-reported mind wandering, which seems to kind of support the idea that there are some common underlying mechanisms that make you more likely to be distracted by both your own thoughts and also the external environment. But the important question is, what are these mechanisms? So models of selective attention argue that there are two things, sort of two categories really of influences on distraction. One is to do with voluntary attention and sort of top-down mechanisms that allow you to focus voluntary attention. So in a way, distraction can just be seen as the failure of those mechanisms. And there already is some research suggesting that common frontal mechanisms are involved in preventing involuntary thoughts, including both intrusive thoughts and mind wandering, in the same way that they are in avoiding external distraction. But the selective attention literature really highlights that failures of voluntary attention are only one part of the story in understanding distraction. There's also another really important influence on distraction, which is basically what is there to distract you. So I think it's intuitively obvious that if you think of external distraction, that a person with a certain level of voluntary attentional control is going to find it much easier to avoid distraction in some situations, such as a very quiet room, compared to others, like a soft play centre full of jumping children. This kind of reflects the idea that you have not only how well you can execute voluntary attention, but you also just have the automatic priority, which is signal coming from the stimuli around you. So I'm interested in the extent to which this might also apply to thoughts. Like, are there certain thoughts that have more priority and that are more likely to get your attention and to distract you? In thinking what these properties might be, there's vast amounts of literature on what makes external stimuli salient. One factor is perceptual salience, so things that stand out from their environment in some way physically. But there's also increasing interest in more motivational forms of salience, so things that are associated with reward or with a negative emotion tend to be good at catching our attention and distracting us. So part of the purpose of the present study is to consider to what extent these automatic priority mechanisms might also apply to thoughts. And with respect to the motivational salience, that seems particularly interesting and particularly plausible with respect to thoughts, because as in the example I gave at the beginning, quite often thoughts that distract you are motivationally salient in some way, like whether it's associated with reward, so maybe about food or thoughts about something else you're craving, or thoughts about scary things. So actually, Paloma and I have some other interesting data, which I'm not presenting today, but that seems to show that in the course of the pandemic, rates of mind wandering raised by 15%. And this is perhaps because one explanation is that everybody's thoughts got a bit scarier and a bit more salient. So the overall approach to our study is to first try to plant a specific involuntary thought, which we did by adapting a method which you're probably mostly familiar with. So it's, for a long time, it's been known that if you ask people to think of something, and this was originally established with a white bear, so you ask somebody not to think of something, and then tell them not to think of it. And telling somebody not to think of something actually induces involuntary thoughts about things. So this white bear paradigm is a way to kind of plant a thought. And in this way, because you know what the thought is, you can actually know what patterns of neural activity to look for reflecting that thought, so that you can measure it when it occurs. But we decided, as a first attempt to use this method, rather than using a white bear, we would use something that has a very well-established neural marker, which is faces. So we actually used the faces of Cluedo characters, Miss Scarlet and Mrs. Peacock. So just to go through the design in a little bit more detail, the first thing we did outside the scanner is we did a short training phase in which participants, the goal of it was to associate some kind of reward with the faces. So this was an attempt to make them more motivationally salient. We adapted a paradigm that's been used in the external attention literature to test for effects of reward on attentional capture by visual stimuli. So we used a very similar paradigm, but applying it to things that are then going to be thoughts. Originally, just for transparency, we originally intended to kind of compare, because one face was associated with high reward and one with lower reward, and we originally intended to do some analyses looking at this, but we couldn't for reasons that I will describe later. So the next step inside the scanner is we ask participants to first look at the face and also to think of the faces. And while they're doing this, we are localizing the FFA response, and we're also collecting the specific pattern of activity within FFA, which we can then use as a template later on for looking for reactivation of that pattern. The next step, which is really the main task, is that we ask them to do a sustained attention task, but we really strongly emphasize, don't think about this person. Don't think about the characters at all while you're doing the task. And at the end of every block, we ask them firstly what they were thinking just now. Was it the character that you weren't meant to be thinking of? Was it the task, or was it just something else, like other general mind wandering? But we also include a second probe, which asked, did you think of the characters at any point in the whole block, right? So it's, did you think of them just now, and did you think of them at any point? And we use different probes for different aspects of our analysis. The final thing they did in the scanner was a short kind of localizer task, really, in which this was the distraction task that I mentioned earlier that I found correlates with mind wandering. And we use this external distraction task to localize the posterior parietal response to salient external distractors in order to see whether the same regions might also respond to internal distraction. So there's certain posterior parietal regions, particularly IPS, that have been implicated in attentional priority. And this can be priority not only through perceptual salience, but also motivational salience. So we're interested to see, will these regions also be activated when there's an involuntary salient thought? So this is a nice design summary diagram that Paloma had made. So first outside value training, then they look at the faces, then they try and ignore the faces and we measure whether they have involuntary thoughts, and then finally the external distraction localizer. So with respect to our first goal, which was just to establish the methods to objectively measure involuntary thoughts, it seemed like this worked. So first, we looked at this in a couple of ways. First, we just did a univariate analysis. And this was looking at the 2-second period immediately prior to the first probe, when we asked, what were you thinking just now? So when participants reported having been thinking about the face, there was a significant increase in FFA activity compared to when they reported being on task. And this was also seen at single subject level for most people. So you can see here, we've got 4 rows, but this row, the brains immediately, basically above where it's univariate analysis, this is 7 subjects, and then below this is another 7. So there's kind of pairs of the same brain, and you can see what what the activity looks like when they're viewing the face, and then directly underneath it for each subject during thoughts about the face. And hopefully you can see that for the majority of the subjects, there were some common activations, and it tends to be that whichever sort of side of FFA people saw the strongest activity in when they were viewing the face was also reflected in their thoughts about the face. And it's worth noting that this was actually on the 1.5T scanner. So I hope that in terms of thinking about future research, I would expect that using a 3T, we would get even better results. So you might notice that there's only 14 subjects on this screen, which brings me to a sad part of the findings, which is the behavioural results. The pilot data that I'd collected prior to this study led me to expect that I would get intrusive thoughts from 25% of probes. And I can't remember how many probes we had, but maybe 30. So we were expecting a lot of thoughts. What actually happened was we got way less thoughts than we were expecting. And only 14 out of 24 participants reported any thoughts at all in the period immediately before probes. So if you remember, the first probe asks, what were you thinking just now? So only 14 people ever said they were thinking of the faces, which meant that really restricted our sample for the univariate analysis, which was very sad. And that was the reason we abandoned our original aim, which was to then subdivide into the two different faces, because we had so few thoughts that we've just kind of considered all the faces together, whether it was either one of them. But on the positive side, our multivariate analysis focused on the second probe, which asked whether they had thoughts at some point during the task blocks. And for this, we got more subjects who had actually had the thoughts. And this kind of shows an advantage of the multivariate analysis, that it allows you to just use more of the data, not only more of the subjects, but also just more of the time period you're scanning. So the first thing we did was a mean similarity analysis. And this is looking at the activity during sustained attention blocks as a function of whether the participant had reported at the end of the block having a thought about a particular character, or whether they were on task, and the extent to which this correlates with activity when they were viewing that specific character's face. And you can see that the overall similarity between Miss Scarlett and her template was much higher during when an involuntary thought was reported compared to on task, and the same thing is true for Mrs. Peacock. And this pattern was also seen in the majority of subjects, so this is just sort of showing for every subject the pattern. So it was fairly consistent pattern. As well as just the averaged similarity across the block, we also looked for discrete reactivation events. So this would be time periods, or rather volumes, where there was a particularly strong and unusually strong correlation with the template. And this is quite interesting, because this is really, you would think, might reflect the actual time, allow you to pinpoint the time when a thought actually occurred. So you can see, compared to the baseline, which is when they reported being on task, people had more reactivations during blocks where an involuntary thought was reported. And and as I said, this really means that you can actually use these reactivations to see when these thoughts might have occurred in the block. So rather than just knowing they happened at some point, it seems like we can say these were the volumes that were particularly high correlations. And it wasn't just the number of reactivations, it was the strength of reactivations as well. So the magnitude of the reactivations during the blocks where involuntary thoughts were reported was stronger. So this was our first goal, to objectively measure the thoughts. So our second goal was to then use this method to test for common determinants of internal and external forms of distraction, and with the ultimate goal of knowing where is the priority map for thoughts. So there's a lot of talk about the priority map for external attention, and these posterior parietal regions are often put forward as candidates. So do these also determine priority for thoughts? So we used two approaches to look at this, building on our univariate and multivariate analysis. So the first approach was we did a PPI connectivity analysis, and this focused on the 2 seconds immediately prior to the what were you thinking just now probe. And we used the FFA as our seed, and we looked for regions that were showing more connectivity to FFA prior to an involuntary thought. So the reasoning here was that if a region was upregulating FFA, it should show more FFA connectivity prior to reports of a thought about the face. And we also then tried something maybe a little bit unusual, which is that we used the discrete reactivations, which I mentioned from the representational similarity analysis. And we used these to identify time periods in which thoughts occurred. So now just ignoring the probe responses completely, so this is why I'm calling it a probe-free approach, ignoring the probe responses, we just identified timings on the grounds of these reactivations. And we examined whether we could build a new univariate model based on these timings rather than having to rely on any subjective report. And this is a really different way of looking at thoughts, just ignoring the subjective component completely. So we were kind of interested in whether these two different approaches would produce similar results. So first, and so we had regions of interest for this, which were firstly the lateral posterior parietal cortex, which we defined functionally using the external distraction task. We were also interested in the precuneus because the precuneus is a more medial posterior parietal region, which is often implicated in mind wandering, part of the default mode network. So we were interested in whether this might alternatively play a different role, a role specifically in priority for thoughts as opposed to external stimuli. And finally, because we had associated our distractors with reward, we were interested in looking in regions of the reward network. So we built an anatomical ROI of incorporating striatum. So first, looking at the posterior parietal regions from the external distraction task, you can see here on the left, and the internal distraction task, we found that the PPI analysis shows common overlapping parietal recruitment for both external distraction and involuntary thoughts, which is quite promising, suggesting that these regions might play a role in priority for our thoughts and internal distraction. On the other hand, we found this in the PPI analysis. We didn't find this in the probe-free analysis. But the other regions of interest we found, oh yes, sorry. So this, yes, I've already said that. But the other regions of interest, the precuneus and the striatum, we actually found activity for both approaches. So the connectivity analysis and the probe-free analysis both implicated both of these regions. So to summarize this data, and then I'll move on to the future directions. Both the univariate and multivariate approaches seemed to be able to objectively index the occurrence of thoughts, and this was on the 1.5T scanner. And this was seen at single subject level for the majority of participants. And although both approaches worked, the multivariate approach has the advantage that you can use the entire task block, so you don't lose so much data. And we also found that the occurrence of salient involuntary thoughts was associated with activity in certain regions, which have also been implicated in external distraction, like in the lateral parietal regions, and regions that have been implicated in upregulating distraction from the reward, as well as the precuneus. So further questions, some of which might be answered by further analysis of this data and some of which might require a new study. One is, why was the lateral parietal activation only seen for the PPI analysis and not for the probe-free analysis? And one thought that we had about this is that because the PPI analysis focused on the 2 seconds immediately thought before people subjectively reported a thought, whereas the pro-pre analysis completely ignored the subjective responses, it could be that these regions actually play a role in selection for awareness. So they were more activated when we were taking into account people's subjective reports. But I think this would require further research to confirm this. A second, more basic question is, will this method work with anything other than faces or perhaps places? So could you use other stimuli? And I would say the univariate method, no, but the multivariate method, I think it probably should work, because you would just have to do some, as long as you could decode during viewing, you should then be able to identify the pattern that you can use as a template. But this remains to be tested. Another important question is the role of mental imagery. So because we were looking at reactivation of processing that is part of the visual system, we didn't ask our participants whether they were experiencing mental imagery, but one possibility might be that this reactivation was to do with mental imagery. So it would be interesting to see to what extent this correlates with subjectively reported imagery, and also whether people who don't experience any imagery, so people with aphantasia, do they still show these reactivations or not? So in considering future applications, and don't worry, I've only got a few more slides. The first one is it could be used to study negative intrusive thoughts. So for example, you could test participants with and without spider phobia, and have first create a template when they're thinking about a spider, then suppress the thoughts about it and measure reactivations. And you could test things like whether the reactivations are stronger among phobic participants. And you could also look at connectivity between the posterior parietal regions and the amygdala, and how these predict the subjective intrusions and the reactivations. Similarly, as well as negative intrusive thoughts, you could look at rewarding intrusive thoughts, for example, in relation to food or addiction. So one idea that I would like to do is looking at, I've already got a behavioural study on intrusive thoughts about food, where we did something a little bit similar to this, but just with the behavioural report. But basically, you would take hungry participants who have been asked not to eat for that day, and within the scanner, you could ask them to view and also smell with an olfactometer something really delicious like chocolate. And that way you would be able to get a template not only of the visual cortex representation, but also the olfactory representation. And so you could, and then test for reactivation of both of these, which is interesting because theories of food cravings have kind of talked about the visual and olfactory imagery as both being important. And then you could also look at the parietal reward network connectivity and whether this predicts things like changes in pre and post-scan hunger, and maybe even post-scan consumption in one of these disguised taste tests, when you say, oh, just as a complete coincidence, nothing to do with the study, would you like to taste these different chocolate bars, and you measure how much the person eats. And the final application that I am quite keen to explore is to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which I have not capitalized properly, sorry about that, which is very interesting because it's associated with increased involuntary mind wandering, but also increased intrusive thoughts. And it's associated with increased risk of anxiety, obesity, and addiction, which, as I've just mentioned, in all of these involve intrusive salient thoughts. So it's interesting to ask whether some kind of disruptions to the neural mechanisms underlying salient thoughts, perhaps the parietal upregulation of salient thoughts, might actually be a candidate for what's causing all of these patterns. So that is all. So thank you very much for listening to this, and I'm very pleased to hear any comments or questions that you've got. Shall I unshare so that I can see the chat?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, unless you have other slides that might be useful. But
I don't have any. I can reshare if but there we are. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Does anyone have any questions? We've got one comment in the chat about a book, which is potentially interesting and relevant. So Jamie has a question.
Yeah, I mean, mine's a bit of a boring technical one, but it's a really fascinating talk. I mean, it's, a very exciting area. You really sell it well. Yeah, my question is about how you do this kind of RSA analysis. So my understanding is that you take something like the FFA and you divide it like into 100 voxels, and then you look at the pattern of activity for, say, Miss Scarlett in the when you're viewing her compared to something else, and you do a correlation. Can you just kind of just unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's more or less it. You're looking at the multivoxel pattern of activity when you're viewing this. We based it on when you were viewing Miss Scarlett, and then you take that and then you're correlating it with every single volume of the sustained attention task. So you end up with a correlation like an R value for every volume. And then the mean similarity is just the average of those R values, and the discrete reactivations are the R's really much higher than average. Does that make sense?
I think so, but you can separate two faces that way. Yeah, so you have two faces, and you can correlate one face strongly with that and not the other. Is that kind of level? You just know that they're thinking of a face. I suppose. What's the level of granularity?
Well, we could separate the faces, but we haven't focused on that analysis because we were so underpowered for it, because of the fact that we had so few subjects that thought about both of the two faces. It's annoying because it worked on this single subject level, so really it's not like we're fairly confident that it did work. But I think we had 19 subjects that had a thought about a face, but we had much less subjects that had enough. They would have had to have some blocks where they thought only about, because it was not just that, it was like if they said they thought of both faces, then that was hard to, so they had to have a thought where they thought, a block where they thought only about Miss Scarlett, where they thought only about Mrs. Peacock, and some where they didn't think of either at all. And there weren't just quite enough of that. But as I remember, and Paloma can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we did look at that for sure. And as I remember, it did work, but kind of with a small number.
Yes, it did work, but was underpowered. So for this analysis, we used either thinking about a character or both of them. So this is the way we used to separate, because when completely separating between them, there was a trend, but it was quite underpowered.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
We have a question from David.
Yes, David Booth. Sophie and Paloma, I'm wondering why you got so few thoughts. Did you ask people just if they had a thought, or did you ever ask them what was in their thought? Because I wonder if hesitation about fessing up might have inhibited reports that they're having a thought.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last thing. You wonder if
people, some thoughts anyway, people might not have been entirely happy about saying what they were.
Well, we were asking them, did you think about the thing you're not meant to be thinking of, which is the face? So did you think about that? Or did you think about were you thinking about that? Were you thinking about the task? Or were you thinking about something completely unrelated to either? And so it was a kind of categorical response. So they didn't have to give, because I agree, people can't be nervous about reporting the exact contents of their thoughts. But we were testing whether we were particularly interested in when they experienced a thought about the specific stimulus that they were meant to be not thinking about. I don't know why they had fewer thoughts. It was really maddening, because we've done all these studies outside the scanner where they had more thoughts. I mean, I don't know why. It might be that the initial studies that I did, I don't know. But it might be that going inside a scanner is just so sort of unusual and interesting that people were, somehow more focused on that rather than just having thoughts. But we were really sort of trying to induce the thoughts by the end of it, because we were like, no, not another subject where we can't use that data. But I think in a way this is the good thing about the multivariate one, is that although less subjects had thoughts that we kind of caught in the period immediately before the probe, most subjects did have thoughts at some point. So the multivariate approach has the advantage that you can catch all of the thoughts, not just the ones that happen just before you happen to ask them what they were thinking. That makes sense.
Yes, thanks.
Hugo has a question. Maybe.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to say that we've got a really large ADHD service for adults in Brighton, so it'd be really good to do more research involving that particular group. There was a bit done with Neil Harrison, Arjun Sethi and people, Mara, looking mainly at impulsivity rather and novelty processing. But nothing really on mind wandering. We did do a study of people with anxiety, though, generalized anxiety disorder and mind wandering at CISC in collaboration with Christina Ottivani in Rome, and Johnny Smallwood was on some of those papers. And there we were kind of looking at perseverative cognitions as the kind of intrusive element of that characterizes the GAD patients. So it's a long way of asking a question, but does your kind of recollection paradigm sort of bias your results towards that kind of inflexibility in mind wandering rather than the more sort of free-floating mind wandering?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because obviously I can see that we are using a specific paradigm in which we're trying to induce a particular thought. And I think there's pros and cons of different approaches. And I would certainly never argue that this should be like the only way people should study mind wandering from now onwards. I mean, there's a lot of stuff people are just doing, looking at kind of resting state, which gives you much more of the spontaneous element, but then you don't get the involuntary element because you're not constraining people's thoughts so much. I guess what I think this paradigm gives is it gives something about when the thought occurs, and a thought that's by definition involuntary, whereas I would have thought perseverative thought might be, yeah, I see what you mean. You could look at that as getting the same thought, but it's kind of elaborating on the thought, keeping it going once it's started. Whereas I guess my intention with this paradigm was to investigate the moment when the thought occurs and gets into your mind, rather than the kind of ongoing elaboration of it after it occurs, which is also an interesting thing. But it's like the initial capture of attention by thoughts that I think this paradigm maybe has advantages for.
So the paradigm that we were using was where kind of a slow, boring tracking task where the thing you were tracking just changed colour every 20 seconds or so. And we could look to see how quickly people responded to that, and then look at the period beforehand. And to some extent, we could use autonomic indices to see whether people were on or off task as well, before they respond to the probe and then answer the questions about their thoughts. But it's still not quite as, I don't know, I do like the idea of implanting a means of, basically your paradigm. And going back to the ADHD group, one advantage of treated patients with ADHD is that you can then study effects of stimulants of monoamine manipulations quite elegantly, I guess, in the ADHD patients, because you can just test them on and off their medication. And I think there's some interesting questions at that kind of early perceptual cortical level that could be addressed with your paradigm quite nicely.
Yeah, I'm really super interested in doing that. I think part of what's interested me in this whole direction is ADHD. Like, my whole interest in distraction and mind wandering has been driven by an interest in kind of real world attention problems of the type that you experience in ADHD. So it's definitely something I've always had in mind when I'm thinking of these. But yeah, thank you. That's
there is another group there. There's the Tourette's patients, which Charlotte Ray may want to talk about.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Thinking about.
Chris, do you have a question?
I had a question for Hugo, actually. It was just wondering whether you had resting state data from people with ADHD, with that cohort, whether you, or whether you got the data from the long, boring attentional task, fMRI data.
In ADHD, we don't have the tracking task.
Do you have any resting state, or do you know of any large sort of freely available sets of resting state data of people with ADHD?
Not offhand.
Okay.
I wasn't directly involved in the ADHD studies. I was peripherally involved, but I don't think there were resting state studies. I don't know if anyone on the call was involved.
The other thing was to flag up that Ariana had a question in the chat.
Yep.
Yes.
So there's it's quite a long question. I will try and read it out. So very interesting study and nice findings, Sophie and Paloma. Thank you. I have a question about the RSA analysis, which I realise is similar to Jamie's. Was the similarity calculated between the time when participants saw the faces, i.e. initial task, and when they were probed by the question, were you thinking about the face at some point in the block? If so, I'm wondering whether the probe itself prompted participants to think more about the face than the baseline. This is because in memory research, there's a consistent effect from the forgetting literature, which shows that if participants are instructed not to think about an encoded event, the no-think instruction is associated with forgetting. So effectively, some people can prevent retrieval of encoded information. So I'm wondering if you've thought of another more covert way to measure these spontaneous thoughts during the task itself, as opposed to when prompted. This is, of course, for future studies. Does that make sense?
I think so. Well, I mean, to take the first question, so the main similarity, the similarity was basically, yeah, it was the periods where they were doing the sustained attention task. So not the periods where they were responding to the probes, but all of the periods where they were doing the sustained attention task. And then at the end of every block, they were asked this question. But for sure, I mean, within the mind-wandering literature, there's evidence that asking people, probing people more often actually makes you have more, or it affects the rate of your mind wandering. It might make you have less general mind wandering, but probing people and kind of emphasizing to ignore a thought might encourage you to think of that thought more. So I agree that there would be effects of the probe on the occurrence of the thoughts, but we didn't really mind about that. But in terms of a more covert way to measure the spontaneous thoughts, I mean, I think that the reason that we had the probes was because we wanted to use these to confirm that the perceptual reactivations and so on actually did correspond to subjective experience. But I suppose now that we've done that, you could argue that they could be used without probes as a way of indexing thoughts. I don't know if that answers your question, or if anyone else like Paloma or the two Chris's have anything to add, or if Ariana wants to ask something more. Yeah, hopefully that means I answered it. Oh, thank you. Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, so does anybody else have any questions?
Could I ask something, David Booth, off?
Of course, yes, please do.
Off the subject, maybe off the subject, about the background research. Let me unveil myself. Have people looked at the distracting power of any sort of similarity between the focal thought and the distracting thought? Not necessarily of physical characteristics or even conceptual attributes, but maybe motivational similarity or emotional similarity? Are bad thoughts more easily distracting when you're in a bad mood? When you're in a good mood, might be an example, but just off the top of my head, of affective similarity.
Do you mean, so just to make sure I understand, do you mean the kind of the connection between what you were focusing on before you were distracted and then the thought, and like how similar they are to each other? Is that what you mean?
Yes, I mean, to speak very generally, the background from which I'm approaching is the idea that things come to attention because of the similarity to what's in memory. So, the distracting thoughts are presumably coming out of memory into the present. And that the distance between the memory and the present thought might be lower if there was more similarities. If they were totally categorically different, might it be harder or easier? Do you or other people in the area have any?
I'm not sure. I think it's if I understand right, it's a really interesting question, which is kind of like how do you travel from one thing to the other, and and there are studies that look at. I mean, I'm actually running a master's project at the moment that is just doing something completely different, but sort of to get to this, using a word association task. And looking at, if you just tell people a word, what words do they come up with? And then you can look at the semantic distance between the words they retrieve. But I'm also wanting to measure the kind of things about whether, the semantic distance is a bit longer for words that have more salience. So maybe words that have motivational qualities. And there's already evidence that people with ADHD have a greater semantic distance when they do these kinds of tasks, which is quite interesting because that's linked also to creativity. So it suggests that, the mind of somebody with ADHD might just travel a bit further. But it's interesting to think about the role of salience. And I think you're right that manipulating kind of the motivational state also might influence that. So and this is kind of something I've been thinking about, like manipulating hunger. I mean, I had this behavioural study about intrusive thoughts about food, and unsurprisingly, hungry people had more intrusive thoughts about food, But you might predict that if you think about one thing, all of the possible associations to that one thing that are in your mind, there's a lot of them, but maybe some of them are more relevant to your current motivational state, and maybe some of them are just more salient in general through their properties. So it might be some. But it's a very open question. It's something that I'm very interested in, but I think needs a lot more investigation.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, unless anyone else has any questions, I think we can perhaps wrap up there. Thank you very much, Sophie, for a wonderful talk, and thank you everyone for coming. There won't be another CNI next week, but the week after there is a project proposal. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone. I really appreciate you coming.